very much for joining me, John. Much appreciated. If we can start firstly by talking a little bit more about your role and what you do within IBM and how that perhaps fits into the wider business.
So my role's actually a pretty interesting one. I tend to take the global collaboration strategy and I make it relevant from a UK perspective. So it takes into consideration our local biases, our legislation, our culture, the way we do things, the kind of businesses that we do. And for that I get to work very closely with people in the research labs, in the development labs, in sales, in marketing, in technology. The role tends to have fairly long-term discussions with a client. So where you might find that technical engagement is between 3 to 9 months long, I will have a 5-year discussion. So where do you want to go as an organization? What are your plans? Where do you see cloud fitting in? What are your mobile strategies? What are the legislation? What's the legislation that's coming down the track that's influencing the way you need to behave? And what do we do to accommodate that? Or what are the lessons that you've already learned that you'd like us to include in our strategy?
How much of your role within that is spent blue sky thinking, looking at future trends and where the industry and customers are going to move next versus the here and now and what's needed by customers today and tomorrow?
So some of the stuff is absolutely here and now. Some of the stuff is I need you to resolve something now because my business is affected now. But I almost need to have a split brain, and half of the things that I'm dealing with now can be dealt with by looking at business very differently. So blue sky thinking, I think it's worth constraining what that timescale is. I think anything over 5 years is possibly not worth investing too much time and effort in because it could change on a whim. But a number of things I'm working with research on and with development on are very long term. So there's an initiative that I've been working on with the education sector, which is 2 years in the making, and it's now starting to bear fruit. But that involves very long-term strategies such as mobile, such as cloud deployment, such as the legislation. How does that affect what they can and can't do? Where do they want to place the student data? How do they want to integrate that into their process? What does that mean in terms of their existing vendor relationships? How do we partner with people who typically we're in competition with? And those are very long-term views of the world.
So in terms of social business as a theme, as a topic, what does it mean to you within IBM? And also what does it mean to your customers? And how do you connect the dots between the vision that you have as a company and what customers are demanding perhaps in terms of social business?
So social is an interesting term. I met with some people recently and I asked them for their definition of social, and it's a piece of string. Everyone has their own vision of social. It was described to me by an analyst recently as, there's this dice called social, and you roll the dice and whichever face comes up you get a different definition, but it's still the social dice. My view of how social should be perceived is that it's the right level of people interaction, with that right level of transparency. So you can have a social interaction which is one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. It can manifest itself in a non-tool discussion. So a social interaction is me getting up out of my chair and walking across the room and having a discussion with 3 to 4 people. That's as social as it is by getting onto LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter. There are just different artifacts left behind. So IBM's approach is to support the internal requirements of the way that people interact and the way that people interact externally, and to do it in a way that fulfills what the business wants. There's that dimension of what we do in our work life and what we do in our personal life, and different generations treat it differently. So the younger generation would not see a separation between home and work, whereas the older generations might, and the younger generations would tend to use social platforms differently than older generations, but each of them are very social. They're social from a technical perspective, they're social from a personal perspective. But if you take all the tools away, we've always been social. A lot of the tools add nothing new to the way that we interact. They just bring substantially more impact, more scale, and a more real-timeness, if you like, to those types of interactions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned there that it's kind of things that we've always done, in terms of interacting with other people. But in some other respect, it feels like social's, very hot right now, but it's not come out of nowhere. So what are the driving forces behind this renewed focus or more emphasis on social right now within businesses?
So there's potentially a renewed focus because some of this is being driven by marketing. And there's an interest in potentially monetizing those interactions with the client. But they are based on very old metrics. So historically, you would find that marketing had returns of between 3 to 6% based on campaigns. So you'd put a piece of paper in a magazine, you'd ask people to return that piece of paper if they're interested, they'd get some sort of response. And it was actually a very small response. But the reality is that they had already pre-qualified that. It takes a bit of effort for you to take something out of a magazine, fill your details in, send it back. 3 to 5% is pretty good based on 100%. But if all you have to do is move your mouse over something and click on something and you've got 50, 60, 70, 80% penetration, it looks good, but the conversion rate is actually fundamentally different. So I think they've seen the impact that social can have in terms of actually getting a response from someone. So how do you now convert that? So externally, they're using social to bridge that gap. How do I make one of my external clients truly part of my system? How do I get them to serve themselves? So if you look at the way that some organizations get asked to fill our name in externally, it's because we're almost certainly not going to make a mistake with the way we spell our name or with our address. Whereas if we have to fill in forms and send it in, someone in a back room typing stuff in is going to make an awful lot of damage, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. So we've got 8 different versions of the way that my name is spelt, easily, and that's not even my last name. So part of it is getting the client to do something on their own behalf because it suits them. And I think part of the remit of social is not about being sociable. It's not about being, warm and cuddly and doing things for the greater well good. It's fundamentally about doing something because it serves you, and there are a number of people who will participate in that process of helping you serve yourself. And on the face of it, they look like sociable things, but they're actually social things. Mm-hmm. They just involve multiple people.